Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of RE112, where I take stories I've narrated in the past and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is called Wrath, written by LgFatherAnthrocite. Zyko sat on the command ship, dressed himself in body armor, checking his weapons, making sure his supplies were stocked in his carry-all. He strapped his visor to his face and left the small room, heading to the ready room for the final briefing before the drop on Sol 3. His people had come to Earth to conquer the system and claim the resources that were available. Water, iron, fissionable material, all sorts of resources were waiting to be claimed, while the humans sat there, squatting on the treasures of the Sol system, unwilling to harvest them. After getting his briefing and uploading the ops data to his field comp, Zyko, along with his drop mates, walked to the dropship and strapped in. The buzzer sounded, and Zyko hung in the air, weightless in the free fall of the planet's surface. After what felt like an eternity, the retros fired, and the straps dug into his articulation points, threatening to tear him to pieces briefly, before the pressure let up. After a few minutes, the pod's thrusters cut out and dropped the last few centimeters to the ground. The doors popped open and the drop group hustled out into the strange alien air. No one on the drop pod would ever make it home. Ikrit stood on the bridge of the flagship of the Jovian fleet. The Pleria were the pride of the fleet. Having been through 6 invasionary conquests, the Sophons of the galaxy had a nasty habit of leaving resources uncollected, and the Jovians found this wasteful. The inhabitants of those systems would not gather the precious commodities of these systems. The Jovians would. This drop was not going as the Ikrit and his people, the Jovians, had hoped. The inhabitants of the system, who called themselves humans, were proving to be especially tenacious. Already troop losses were nearly double of that were for the last 2 invasions. And not a single city had been completely pacified. Some footholds were made, but the people of this planet proved to be both exceptionally difficult to kill and preternaturally good at fighting in nearly every type of terrain. Ikrit was going through reports. The humans were a nightmare. Their tactics and strategies were disturbingly varied. Some were the brutal shows of force meted out by the various military organizations on the planet. Others seemed to be the actions of rogue groups of civilians. From frontal assaults to sniper attacks to guerrilla tactics, there was an endless string of reports, each detailing a different plan of attack, different strategies, desperate tactics. After the first few weeks, the losses had suddenly jumped up in number. Soldiers were dying of never-before-seen infections, poisonings, and equipment failures. It took months to determine that microorganisms of the planet were often pathogenic in nature, and the Jovians had no mechanisms for defense against them. The humans had somehow managed to taint either the food or the water left in their cities, leading to the massing numbers of deaths. The equipment failures were all cases of sabotage, either mechanical or, just as likely, covertly installed software that would wreak havoc on control systems. According to one report, an entire shuttle facility was lost when an inbound shuttle suddenly lost power on approach and crashed. The core of the ship's drive went critical, and the resultant detonation scoured an entire kilometer of land clear of any buildings or structure. Ikrit assessed the progress his invasion had made. He had expended an enormous amount of resources on this invasion. Millions of troops, thousands of vehicles, countless tons of food, water, and ammunition. All Ikrit had to show for his efforts was a pile of reports describing the many failures of the troops and all that equipment. In some places, in the Eurasian landmass, troops were literally freezing to death as supply lines were constantly disrupted. Vehicles were constantly malfunctioning due to control software corruption. Buildings and bases were constantly harassed, often to the point of destruction. It wasn't uncommon for homemade bombs to be flown in with small flying drones, which crashed into the bases, causing damage and disrupting operations. In the Americas, there were reports of some humans were hunting Jovians like they were prey animals. More than a few patrols had been found strung up by their legs from trees. a running tally was found on one of the data nets the Jovians had managed to tap into. Civilians were trying to see who could kill more of his troops, like it was some sort of game. There were rules about what counted as a fair kill. They were killing his troops like animals, and they had to restrict the methodology to make it a challenge. Ikret compiled the losses in materials, resources, and lives. He sent the data to the homeworld along with his recommendation to withdraw. The humans were devastating enemies. The final incident had been when he received a report of an entire operational base that had been overrun. Every usable resource was removed, and the only thing left behind were the corpses of the Jovian soldiers. Every single one had been killed with a weapon made out of native plant called bamboo. Ikret had received the command. The loss of resources were incongruent with the progress being made. Invading Earth was a losing proposition. The withdrawal command was issued. Troops returned to the ships and shuttles that were barely operational and were still suffering from software corruption. Once the planet had been cleared of troops, the fleet exited the system and made a jump to hyperspace. A few days into the trip home, a communique came in from Jervia. The Pleria, along with the rest of the fleet, was to remain in orbit, and the troops were to spend 2/10 of an orbit on board in quarantine. Considering the microbes of Earth, Ikret considered this a wise choice. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace and began to orbit Jervia. The surviving troops were glad the peace and quiet, as they had been under constant strain on Earth, never knowing when the natives would launch an attack. While they were in orbit, Ikret had the shuttles run through any and every diagnostic it could to ensure that they worked properly when it was time to send troops planetside. Later, it would be determined that this was a terrible mistake. The quarantine was over and troops were being shuttled down to the surface. Ikret was on his way down with the first load to give his report, when the whole shuttle suddenly lurched to the side. Ikret cursed and called the pilots to see if they had regained control. They informed him that the shuttle was under control, but the turbulence was caused by an explosion. From the front screens of the cockpit, a massive smoke cloud could be seen rising in the air. Just as the shuttle landed, another massive explosion shook the tarmac. Nearly 2 decades later, Jervia was finally returning to normal. After the Pleria had taken up orbit, it began communicating with ground-based systems in the Jervian homeworld. Voice and video calls to loved ones, control and telemetry data, reports, and, unbeknownst to the Jervians, a computer virus. It silently copied itself to every system it could, starting with the shuttle controls and working its way through every data system on the Jervian homeworld until it was infecting some 80% of DataNet. When the built-in countdown timer of the virus hit 0, the virus started to randomly kill processes in whatever system it was infecting. Transports fell out of the sky, power plants would shut down or go critical, ground vehicles would go out of control or suddenly shut down. The death toll was enormous. Whole stretches of lands were rendered uninhabitable due to radioactive and/or chemical contamination. Emergency services were crippled by non-functional equipment. Communications all but halted. Datanets went dark as the hardware they ran on failed. Industries ground to a halt. Millions died in the ensuing chaos. Millions more starved to death because automated and computerized farming equipment failed. What food was gathered was difficult to transport. Riots broke out, claiming even more lives. When a sample of the virus was finally analyzed, hidden in the code was a single line of Terran Common. Anger becomes a sit of wrath when it is directed against an innocent person, when it is unduly strong or long-lasting, or when it desires excessive punishment. End of story. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Bushmaster 177, Henry the Red, Caspar Arnholtz, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Elijah Silvercross, Dragzoon WRE, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.